Now, this morning, if you will, turn over with me to Luke chapter 15. Luke 15 is, and we're studying, this is the beginning of a series that I'm calling Snapshots. Used to go through the picture album. Today, we basically look at them either on iPod or iPhone or on the computer, but I can remember when the only picture you had was that snapshot that you had in your hand. Remember those? And for a long time, they were pretty well just black and white, unless you got real fancy and went somewhere and had your picture made at Olin Mills or some close. But a lot of them were just old black and white pictures. And then later, the Kodak Instamatic and the Polaroid camera came out, in which you could actually take a picture and wait, I think it was 60 seconds, and peel that paper off, and you had a snapshot. And that kind of saved that moment in time. You probably can go back and look at yourself when you were young. Isn't that right? Hair a lot darker, maybe a few pounds lighter, maybe a little more hair. But nevertheless, you could go back and see that froze moment in time. You remember that, those snapshots? Well, the same thing is true when Jesus taught in parables, and we're looking at 8 parables in which Jesus gives us a snapshot into the kingdom of God. Now, the setting of this parable begins really in chapter 15, verses 1 and 2. Now, we're going to read from over in verse 12, but I just want to show you kind of the setting of the story, because this is the reaction that Jesus has to the attitude of the religious people of that day. Now, all the tax collectors and the sinners were coming near him to listen to him. Can you imagine this? What a revival that must have been, that all of these folks, the tax collectors, that was about as low on the totem pole as you could go. That was the low man. They looked at the tax collector as a sinner, as an opportunist. Not only the tax collectors, but the sinners. The word sinners there has the connotation of people who not only lived in sin, but who were what we would call today the unchurched. It is the folks that didn't attend church. And they were coming listening to what Jesus had to say. And there was this big kind of revival that was going on among all these people that were following him. But notice those who followed Jesus were tax collectors and sinners. And in verse 2, both the Pharisees and the scribes begin to grumble. Well, now what in the world have they got to grumble about? Well, he tells us, saying, this man receives sinners and eats with them. Now notice this. His reaction is to their attitude of self-righteousness, and he is going to teach them a lesson. He's going to teach 3 parables. 2 of the parables are parables that tell us about how we can be lost. For instance, the first parable that he talks about is the lost sheep. In verse 4, he talks about a man having 100 sheep and losing one, and he goes out and he looks for him till he brings him back to the 99. And then he says there's great joy in heaven over one sinner that repents than the 99 that were there. And then he tells another parable, a parable of the lost coin. There was a lady who had 10 coins, and she lost one of them. And she goes out and she looks for it and hunts and sweeps and cleans up. Sometimes things get to the point that, and maybe it's this way in your shop, hopefully not your house, but in your shop, to find the tool, you just have to stop and clean up. You know, pick things up, throw things away, and there it is. There it is. And so he is telling these parables, and the first parable about the lost sheep is about people who are lost by just wandering off. They didn't mean to be lost, but like a sheep, they just kind of wandered away. Or like the coin. The coin has no sense of consciousness, and he's lost, but he don't know that he's lost. And so you notice that in both times, it was the shepherd and the woman who did the searching to bring them back. And that's the point that Jesus wanted to make, that some people just wander off, and it's the responsibility of those who are religious, those people who are the believers, to go out and find them and bring them back. Sometimes people are lost and don't know they're lost. Well, guess what? He says in this parable, it's your responsibility to go out and find them and to bring them back. Obviously, they serve with responsibility themselves, but if you'll notice, the action was taken by the shepherd, not the sheep, and the woman, not the coin. And the point is is that, and I guess this is kind of the key takeaway as we get to the third parable of the prodigal son, is that the Father's door is always open and the Father's message is always welcome. It's always welcome. He didn't just write the sheep off as being lost inventory. She just didn't write the coin off as a lost heirloom. But they saw value in both and were willing to do what it took to go and get them. Now, notice now as we come to this third parable, which is a snapshot, you know, there's some people that are the snapshot of the lost sheep. That is, they get sick and they don't attend church for a while, and before long, when they get well, they're just not there anymore. You see, they didn't mean to be lost. They just kind of got out of fellowship with God through their illness or through working or some trial that occurs, and it wasn't that they were rebellious. It's just that they're just no longer here anymore. They get married and they get busy, and before you know it, they're away from the fellowship of God. They didn't that they don't love God or they don't believe in God, but they're like that sheep. They just kind of wander away. And some are like the coin. You know, there's a snapshot of some folks who are like the coin. I'm sure we could go out and see some of our neighbors, and they're lost. They don't know they're lost. They're like the coin, you see, the snapshot of the coin. And then there are some, though, that are like the snapshots that are in the story of the prodigal son. And there are three truths that I want us to see this morning as we look at this parable in depth. He said that a man had two sons, verse 11, and the younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of the estate, the inheritance that falls to me." So he divided his wealth with him. Now, the first truth that I want you to notice with me is that the Father loves us even when we rebel against him. Now, that's written on your handout. The Father loves us even when we rebel against him. You see, the story begins with a son in verse 12. And the son is discussing with the father something that was kind of important, and that is inheritance. He says, "Give me the inheritance that befalls me." Under the Jewish law, there are two sons, and so the older son, this is the younger son talking, the older son would have received 2/3, that is 66% of the father's inheritance. And the younger son would have received 1/3, 33% of the inheritance. And the younger son comes and says, "Dad, I've been thinking about this, and I want my inheritance now." Well, you know what the problem with this is, don't you? To receive an inheritance, what's got to happen? Somebody's got to die. Somebody's got to die. What is this younger son saying? He is saying, "Dad, I had rather have your riches than to have your relationship. I'd rather have riches than the relationship. I'd rather have those than have you." And the father does something that no Middle Eastern dad would have ever done. Most Middle Eastern dads would have probably given him a good head slap on the back of his head and sent him on his way, tell him that that's not going to happen, but the father gave it to him. Notice that he asked for his portion, and what happens? And the father, so not many days, he divided his wealth with him, verse 12. Now the son goes down the wrong path. Look in verses 13 through verse 16. "And not many days later, the younger son gathered everything together, that he went on a journey into a far country or distant country. There he squandered his estate with loose living." The King James Version puts it very poetically. It says they wasted their substance on riotous living. "And now when he had spent everything," that is, when the younger son had spent everything, a severe famine occurred in the country, and he began to be impoverished. In other words, in want. So he went and he hired himself out as a citizen to the country, and he sent him into the fields to feed swine. Now he would have gladly filled his stomach with the pods, that is, the food that the swine were eating, but no one gave him anything to eat. Now, this is kind of an interesting thing. If you're under 21 years of age, I want you to listen very carefully to what has happened right here. If you're under 21 years of age, listen, the world will take everything you have and give you nothing you need. The world will take it all away from you and not give you anything that you need. He takes his money, he goes, he gets him an apartment, or he gets him a good place to stay, and he parties and he has a good time. But what is the problem? At some point, the money runs out. But not only does the money run out, a famine occurs, so there's no access by anybody, and there's nobody there to give him anything. And so he decides, well, I better get a job. And the only job he could come up with, and you could imagine how embarrassing and how humiliating it would have been for a young Hebrew boy to be hired on to be a pig farmer. He's a pig farmer. He goes out to feed the pigs, and he says that he would have eaten even the food that the pigs were eating, because nobody, the fair weather friends, the guys that were with him all the time, you see people on TV that are celebrities and athletes that get into trouble because of their fair weather friends, and then when the money's gone and everything is spent, they're gone too. And that's what has happened here. And so this young man is by himself. He's down there feeding the swine, and this boy has lost everything but one thing, and that is a father's love. God loves you. That's what Jesus is teaching here, and there is no limit. Listen to me. When you think about this boy, he leaves home, he wastes his money, he ends up in a pig pen, he's in famine, nobody's willing to help him. Listen, there's no limit to how far God will let you go, and there's no limit as to how far and how long God will wait for you to return. That's the key thing that he is wanting us to learn from this particular verse. God says that, listen, no matter who you are, if you fall, I'm going to let you fall. But when you're ready to return, I'm going to be ready right there, willing, ready, waiting for you to return. Remember years ago, there used to be an old TV commercial about Red Roof Inn? You remember that? They talked about it. It was kind of a folksy type commercial that they had this music playing. It was kind of corny, but yet it was real folksy and kind of made you have kind of a warm feeling. And at the end of it, Art Modell would always say something. Anybody remember what he used to say? We'll leave the light on for you. That's right. We'll leave the light on for you. The Father will always leave the front porch light on for you. No matter who you are, how far away from from Him you get, how down you get, God will always leave the light on for you to come home. And then number two, not only does God love us even when we rebel against Him, but God accepts us when we return to Him. Now, scene one of this parable ends in verse 16. So he went and he hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, and he sent him into the fields to feed swine. But now notice verse 16, and he would have gladly filled his stomach with the pods that they were eating, but nobody gave him anything. But now notice verse 17. But when he came to his senses, but when he came to himself. You know, when you live in sin, you don't think right. We can be real busy in sin trying to justify what we're doing. We can be real busy in sin trying to explain and give a reason for what we're doing. We can, while living in sin, be real busy trying to deny that we're in sin. But yet, he says, in this hog pen, this boy came to himself. He came to himself. And when his senses returned, he said, I'm going to return to the Father. In other words, my reasoning has come back. And notice the description here beginning in verse 18. Well, I will get up and go to my father and will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight, and no more worthy to be called your son. Make me as one of your hired men. And so he got up and he came to his father. You see, he did what he needed to do. And here is a snapshot of the Father's love for anyone who wants to return home. Because notice what happens is this boy realizes, I am not where I ought to be. You know, he's sitting there hungry and he's thinking, you know, in my Father's house, there are servants that's got more to eat than I do. And I'm a son. Can you imagine that? I'm scrounging around here in this pig pen and this filth. And my Father's got employees that are better off than I am. They're a lot better off than I am. And the reason that he saw that is because the Father's love is for anyone who is willing to return. You come home and the Father, notice what happens here as we continue reading verse 20. And he got up and he came to the Father, but when he was still a long way off, his Father saw him and felt compassion for him, and he ran and embraced him and kissed him. You see, when he came back to God, when he was willing to repent, to return, go back home, the Father, you see, he saw him with what? With eyes with compassion. He ran to him with feet of forgiveness. He spoke to him with a heart of forgiveness. He fell upon him with the arms of forgiveness, and he kissed him with the lips of forgiveness. The word kiss there literally means that he just began to kiss on him and kiss on him and kiss on him. Not just kiss him a little peck on the chin, but to just smother him in kisses, just like we do little babies. You know how you just smother a baby in kisses? That's what he's talking about here. Is that Father, he just fell on this boy. He ran to him, he fell on him, and he just began to kiss him and just so grateful that he was back home, that he was there. And the Son had prepared a speech. Look in verse 21. And the Son said to him, see, he's true to his commitment. He said, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight, no more worthy to be called your son. And he's saying, let me come back, but I don't want to come back as your son, but I want to come back as your servant. Big difference. Notice here the conversation. In the beginning, it was, Father, give me. Now, it is, Father, make me. Make me one of your slaves. Make me. See the difference? In that stint out in the hog pen, what it had done, and the change of attitude. But the Father wouldn't hear anything of it. And the Father said to the slaves, quickly bring out the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet. You realize what the Father is saying here? I'm not going to make you a slave. You're a son. And he's talking now, Jesus is talking about those old tax collectors and sinners that the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling about. He says, you're a son, you're not a slave. And we know this by three things that he says to do. Number one, he says, put the best robe on him. Let me ask you something. In that house, who do you think owned the best robe? The Father did. He said, go get my best robe and put it on him. Isn't that what Paul said in Galatians 3, verse 27? For as many of you have been baptized in Christ, have been put on Christ, the robe of righteousness. I don't stand before God in my righteousness, but I stand before God in the righteousness of Jesus. He said, put a ring on his finger. You know what that ring represented? It was a signet ring that would stamp seals, and it made things official. He's saying, give him the family credit card. This is the ring represented the resources of the family. You know, when God brings us back into the family, he doesn't put us on probation. See, the Father didn't say, okay, go get him some clothes and we'll see how this goes. And if you do fine, then we'll start talking about getting you back into the family. He didn't do that. What did he do? He said, give him the signet ring and put shoes on his feet. Hey, slaves didn't wear shoes. Sons wore shoes. And so he says, bring the best robe, put the signet ring on his hand, and give him shoes. Cover him with my righteousness, give him my resources, and let him know in his relationship, he is not a slave, he is a son. He's a child. Now, you know, this morning, this may be a snapshot of you. So many times we find ourselves just like this, as maybe that prodigal son and that father. Let me ask you a question. In verse 24, why do you think the Father did all this? Well, he tells us in verse 24, For this my son was dead and has come to life again. He was lost and has been found. And he began to celebrate. You know, the first part of the story is good news for the bad guys, isn't it? When I rebel against God, God's waiting for me to come back home. But let me just show you real quickly that the story doesn't end here, because there's some bad news for the, quote, good guys, the scribes and the Pharisees. The second part of the story, the religious folk of that day. And he says to them, you've got to come home too. Huh. What do you mean I got to come home? Well, he explains. Now, the older son, verse 25, was in the field, and he came and approached the house, and he heard music and dancing, and he summoned one of the servants and began inquiring what these things be. And he said that your brother has come, and your father's killed the fatted calf, because he has received him back safe and sound. Well, what was the attitude of the older son? But he became angry and was not willing to go in. And his father came out and began pleading with him. But he answered and said to him, Father, look, for so many years I have been serving you, and I've never neglected command of yours, and yet you have never given me a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came who had devoured his wealth with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him. Verse 31, and the father said to him, Son, you've always been with me, and all that is mine is yours. And we had to celebrate and rejoice, for this brother of yours was dead and has begun to live, and was lost and has been found. You see, the Father pursues us even when we reject him. See, there's more than one son. There's another son, that is the older son, who was at the house all along. And rather than rejoicing that his brother was back, he became angry. Now, why do you think this brother was angry? He says, I have obeyed all of your commands. Now, here's this boy talking to his father, and he says, now, you know, it's one thing to say that you're a good son or a good daughter, but it's another thing to say, I have done everything, I have obeyed you perfectly, but I'm not going in. I've never disobeyed you. I'm sure that the father could have reacted this way. You just disobeyed me. He could have said that. You've just said no to a command. What do you mean you've done this perfectly? And so I think the reasons that he was angry is he felt that this brother wasn't worthy. And let's just say for just a moment that this is true. But what makes a son a son? Is it performance or is it position? It's position. You see, the younger was a son, and it was not based on his performance, but it was based on his relationship with the Father. And so that's vital, that's important. We have to be careful that we don't look at people, because, see, we can find ourselves like the younger son, or we can find ourselves just like the older son. Well, I go to church and he don't. Look how much better than I am. Have you ever noticed how that self-righteous people, like those scribes and Pharisees, Jesus taught this whole lesson on the point that they were grumbling because this man received sinners. He's grumbling because, you know what that means? Jesus was saying, welcome, come on in, welcome, I'm glad that you're here. You know, today we can soothe our conscience and say, oh, we love the sinner, we just don't want him here. Isn't that right? It's real easy to do that. They smell funny. They dress differently. They talk differently. But that's not what Jesus said, you see. And the snapshot for me is, don't be the older brother. Now, I may not be the younger brother that's gone out in the rebellion of sin, but I can be the older brother who does not welcome the younger brothers back. How do you think that younger brother smelled? Now, he'd been down there in the hog pen. How do you think he smelled? You notice his daddy didn't have a word to say about that. How do you think he was dressed? You think he was clean, had right guard and left guard on? Had good aftershave? I'm sure he was physically, emotionally, spiritually a bankrupt. Just bankrupt. Smelled of swine. But his father fell upon him and kissed him. You know, this morning, the lesson that I get right here is that I can't be comparing myself with other people. The older brother did what self-righteous people do. They compare themselves with people they consider unrighteous. And so this morning, we don't want to be an older brother. The older brother dealt with punishment. The father dealt with pardon. The older brother talked of guilt. The father talked of grace. The older brother spoke of revenge. The father talked of reconciliation. Now, as I close out this morning, which do you think would have been the easiest? And let me put it this way. Which one is easier to get to a doctor? A person who is sick and knows that he is ill and that he needs medical attention, or the person who is sick but will not accept the fact that he's sick? See, that's what it's all about right there. We're all sick. And we all need the Father's love. This morning, if you need to return home as the prodigal, be washed in the blood of the Lamb, have that robe of righteousness placed upon you through baptism, we want to encourage you to do that while together we stand and sing.